Welcome back to another episode of Best Pod Available. Joe DeLeone, Ryan Roberts. We're digging into some of the biggest discussions around the 2026 NFL Draft. We're going to talk about two guys who have some medical concerns, some deep medical histories that are probably going to come into play once the NFL Combine comes around. But we want to start today, Ryan, with something I keep getting asked a lot about, you keep getting asked a lot about, and seemingly it's a debate. I never thought that it would be. A lot of people are wondering, should the Raiders consider trading back from the first overall pick if somebody comes up and wants Fernando Mendoza? Is it worth it? And just to simplify this, let's not present this as if somebody offers a ridiculous you can't say no situation, because I think that's a stupid way of putting it. If somebody starts reaching out to you, if it's the Jets, if it's the Browns, and you're the Raiders, and they start that conversation, do you entertain it or do you shut it down?
You entertain it. I think that it is. I think it's stupid. I was going to use an easier word, or like a nicer word, but I think it's stupid not to take the phone call. Right? Like, that doesn't mean that you don't end up taking Fernando Mendoza. That doesn't mean that he's not your guy. But I really think that if you are too self-absorbed to understand and to listen to every single possibility out there, I think that you're missing the boat of just making a good decision. And that's like a life lesson to a degree. Like, I want as much information as possible before making a big decision like that, especially when you're investing a lot of money, a lot of capital, but then also you are hitching your wagon to a franchise quarterback for the next several years, if depending on how long it works out, or if it works out in general. So the Raiders need to listen to everything. Like, there should be no phone call that the Raiders don't take, right? Because again, that doesn't mean that you have to be obligated to something. That doesn't mean that you have to end up doing something. But I really do think that you take every single phone call. It's a fascinating conversation, Joe, because you know the biggest question mark that we don't know? This is the biggest one. Do the Raiders like Fernando Mendoza as a player? We have no idea of that right now, and maybe we'll get a better understanding for it. That is ultimately going to be the decider of if you are open to moving back or not, though. We can make it as easy as you don't have a franchise quarterback. Fernando Mendoza might be a franchise quarterback, so you always take that swing, which I am sympathetic to that perspective. But until we know behind the scenes how much the Raiders like Fernando Mendoza, if they're sold on Fernando Mendoza, if he's a guy that Coach Kubiak, the new head coach, obviously, of the Raiders, likes, that is where this conversation needs to get a little bit deeper. But I think it's stupid. I think it's malpractice for any team not to take every single phone call and to know every possibility that is out there before making a critical decision.
Okay, so to slightly reframe it, I think most teams would be smart enough to at least have the conversation and to hear out what somebody's willing to offer. As I led in this segment, you don't know if somebody is going to completely mortgage their future to get into that position to select Mendoza. This isn't a Bryce Young situation where the Bears had Fields and they needed to pick between the two. Yep. You could take as many phone calls as you want. I think it would be a gigantic mistake to move off of the pick. Take the calls. Okay. Absolutely take the calls. But you don't have another option. There are not really any free agent options that you can go and test things out and
Derek Carr reunion, man. Derek Carr is back. Derek Carr is back, happening. Joe. He's back.
There are not very many options, though, with Malik Willis or like Mac Jones that you could go out there and go and get that you could test to see and then turn to the 2027 draft. We also spent the offseason talking about how this quarterback draft could have a lot of options, and a lot of those guys went back to school. So as much as 2027 looks enticing, I think it would be naive to assume that all those guys end up taking the leaps that we're hoping for. We'll talk about that stuff in the summer. But, Ryan, at the end of the day, you have been a franchise that has just been abysmal at quarterback. Even when Derek Carr was there, I really don't think that like Derek Carr, if you have to look to that as your best quarterback performance over the last 2 decades, it paints the picture of where you're at and the struggles that your franchise have been through. They need something. They need something to build around. And I ultimately, and I'm going to keep saying this offseason, you have an amazing opportunity to take a quarterback and hire a brand new head coach who's an offensive-minded head coach. If there is that buy-in, we're kind of talking in a vacuum here. But if Clint Kubiak likes Mendoza, you get to start and build a foundation in year one. And then year two, you can hit the ground running. You're not in the lame duck situation like a lot of times we've seen recently with first overall pick quarterbacks. I think that this is a dream scenario to be able to take your guy, to build around him instead of having to wait until 2027, take a guy in 2027, and then it's year three under Kubiak that hopefully you're then ready to compete.
Well, I admittedly do want to see Fernando Mendoza, the personality in Las Vegas. What a hilarious just kind of differentiation between what you would expect a Raiders quarterback to be and what Fernando Mendoza. I don't mean that as a negative at all. Fernando Mendoza is a very just kind of wholesome guy, like a wholesome personality, which is like super interesting.
Maybe that means he'll work then.
Maybe. Not disparaging at all. Not disparaging at all. It's a possibility. It's a possibility that he ends up being a very good starting quarterback for the Raiders. Joe, my philosophy is if you don't have a quarterback, you keep swinging until you find one, right? This team, if I'm sitting there at one, I would take Fernando Mendoza. As somebody asked me the other day, it was like, would you just fundamentally be okay with Fernando Mendoza at number one? And my answer is yes, I would fundamentally be okay because he's a quarterback and he's a guy that has showed a lot of progress over the last couple years from his time at Cal to his 1 year at Indiana and showed a lot of positive signs, and he has requisite skill set where I say that guy could be a good starting quarterback in the NFL. And until you have a good starting quarterback in the NFL, you need to keep trying to find one, right? So the Raiders should, as long as they are bought into Fernando Mendoza, they should stick there at one. And because at the end of the day, people are going to offer you that stuff for that pick. Like, it's going to be out there, no doubt about it, because he's the only quarterback in a draft that has a lot of quarterback needy teams. So there is going to be demand for Fernando Mendoza for that number one overall pick. But the conversation of how many first round picks can supplement having your franchise quarterback for the foreseeable future, that's where the conversation gets a little bit deeper for me. And where if they choose to stick at one, I would stick at one and I would take Fernando Mendoza. So we see that eye to eye. But again, I come back to the ultimate question mark, though, is, and then we don't know it right now, do the Raiders believe in Fernando Mendoza? I tend to think that they probably will. I think that they should, most likely.
Well, it's hard for us to answer that question, though, Ryan. It's hard.
Well,
it's like that one. That's the one question we're not going to be able to address.
And we're never going to know the answer to that question either, because even when we're in Indianapolis talking to people in the know of some sort in those conversations, we're going to hear varying opinions of and most people are just going to say oh yeah, they like Fernando Mendoza. They're going to keep it super blanketed one way or the other. They're not going to give you too much. They're not going to show their hands until probably a couple weeks before the draft, where it's there's a report that's going to surface from one of the media talking heads that's going to say, hey, the Raiders are going to draft Fernando Mendoza with the number one overall draft pick, and then the conversation is going to be void at that point. But in February, we need to have this conversation, because that is the tipping point that is going to decide how much they like. Yes, you are correct. We're never going to know that answer. And ultimately, I would be okay with taking Mendoza number one. But my point overall, though, is that if you're going to take a quarterback at one, if you're going to take any player at one, and there's trade offers on the table, you need to have conviction in that pick, ultimately, right? Because it'll be very easy for a Raiders team that has so many holes to say, you know what? We're going to balk. We're going to move back. We're going to get an insane amount of draft capital, and we're going to figure this thing out in a better situation. It's hard to move off of that sometimes. But if they have conviction in them, stay at number one and take your guy, because at the end of the day, if you don't have a quarterback, you have no future.
All right, let's move on to talking about the medical situations for two key prospects. Jordyn Tyson has been inconsistently available, but he is one of the most gifted players in the class. He has unbelievable tools. I think that he could very well become a consistent 1,000-yard guy, a number one receiver on a team. I wonder, knowing how some of these other players that have had his injury history, if he'll still even go in the first round. When we're in Indianapolis, we'll probably get more context on how they feel about his recovery, how teams may feel about his longevity in the NFL. But Can you provide, one, some context here on his injury history, and then two, do you think it's going to catch up to him?
So the injury history for Arizona State wide receiver Jordyn Tyson, he began his career at Colorado, and in 2022, Joe, he tore not his ACL, he tore his ACL, his MCL, and his PCL. So he tore 3 different ligaments in his knee in one injury in 2022. That is obviously disconcerting for a guy that is such an explosive mover, a guy that is a 3-level separator. But then in 2024, and I feel like people probably remember this a little bit more, when Arizona State was making their playoff push, he broke his collarbone and missed the last few games of that season. And then this past year, he missed a couple of games because of the nagging hamstring issue, right? So it's troubling to me. And it would always be more troubling if it's just like, man, this guy's had like 3 different knee issues in the same knee. Like, that's where the degenerative conversation starts. But it is also still unsettling to see a guy that's had 3 different injury-plagued seasons for 3 different variations of injuries. Like, he's had a lower body ligament tear, 3 of them in one knee. He's also had the nagging hamstring issues, which for people that have ever seen the hamstring things, usually that stuff doesn't go away, Joe. Like, hamstring issues usually come back a little bit, man. Like, it is a very nagging injury. But then the collarbone, I'm not as worried about the collarbone because, like, that's a one-off broken bone. Like, it'll be fine. But, like, the issues with lower body stuff does generally worry me a lot. And I think that just in a vacuum, Jordyn Tyson in the NFL, in terms of just the on-field perspective, he's a wide receiver 1 by a lot of NFL teams right now for people that I've talked to. Now, the conversation around the injuries is interesting because we'll get a little bit more context in Indianapolis when they put him through the medicals and everything. But I was told by a scouting source in the league right now, an area scout, that they believe that particular NFL team believes that it's not as bad as some people think it's going to be, the medicals, but it's still not good, right? So, like, there is some middle ground to, like, the worst possible outcome to the best possible outcome. Jordyn Tyson's probably somewhere in the middle. So I tend to think that he's going to be a first-round pick, but if there's a wide receiver between Carnell Tate, Makai Lemon, and Jordyn Tyson that do slide, I think the 2 most likely guys are Tyson due to the injuries and Makai Lemon due to that kind of lack of height, weight, speed, exciting combination of athleticism. But I do think Tyson has a chance to slide somewhere to the mid to late first round conversation in the end, because I do think that the medicals are a big worry. If they weren't a worry, I think we'd be talking about a top 10 NFL draft pick. And it's also possible that he ends up being that if the medicals aren't as bad as we think. But based upon those conversations, I do think that there is going to be some worry on the NFL level for the longevity of Jordyn Tyson.
Yeah, I think that Tyson's film is undoubtedly that of a receiver that would be worthy of going in the top 10. I have compared him to Justin Jefferson. I think that he has that overall smoothness to his game. There is, I believe, a translation to his play style to being a number 1 receiver in an offense. And I think that it's more visible than with Carnell Tate, because Carnell Tate has always been a secondary target. Jordyn Tyson, when he's healthy and he's good to go, he has always been a bucket whenever you've called upon him.
Right.
But the problem is we have not had in back-to-back years full availability from him. As you just laid out the whole framework of the problems that he's been dealing with, we're talking about ligament stuff. We're talking about muscles that tend to catch up to you and tend to be recurring problems. I think that just specifically in the scope of this year's class, there are a lot of really good receivers. There's nothing worse than drafting a very talented receiver, getting bits and pieces out of that potential, and then him not being available to you for a full season. He can barely get through a 12-game college season. How can we expect him to play 17 games and then in the playoffs when he has not been able to do that in college? And I think a lot of NFL teams are going to look at that, and then they're going to compare him to, all right, should we just go with Makai Lemon? Should we just go with Casey Concepcion? Should we just go with Elijah Surratt? Should we just go with Omar Cooper? There is a long list of players who maybe don't have that same ceiling, but at the very least would provide reliability. The other last part with this, I look at a lot of the teams that are in that, let's say, 7 to 20 bucket. There's not a lot that desperately really need a premier number 1 receiver. A lot of those teams are going to be picking at the beginning of the second round. Those are the teams that are picking at the beginning of the first round, like the Raiders, the Browns, the Jets, that just don't have anything.
Titans.
But at the end of the day, Ryan, feels like there could be a strong case to be made that Tyson ends up being a huge steal for a team at the end of the first round that needs a receiver and can maybe be a little bit patient with him, or an up-and-coming team that doesn't need him to be good right away, but needs him to be really good in his second year in the NFL. It doesn't. It's not an indictment that Tyson won't work out. It's just another one of these examples where the NFL pre-draft process might chew him up and spit him out.
I think the word that you said there that I completely agree on is value. Like, because here's the thing. I think Jordyn Tyson's a dog. Like, I think he's a really good player, man. 3-level separator, great downfield acceleration. I think that he has some really good work as a route runner and understanding how to manipulate a stem and attack blind spots. Like, he's a really good football player. As long as he's healthy, he's going to be really good on the NFL level. You know what it reminds me of, Joe, to a degree? I was just looking it up as we were kind of having the initial conversation, because this was eerily similar to me. Do you remember when Landon Dickerson came out of Alabama in the 2021 NFL draft? Now, Dickerson's was a little bit more extreme. He was at Florida State, went to Alabama. He had never finished a college football season. Injuries just everywhere, right? And he was going to be a top 20 draft pick if he was just full bill of health. Well, he falls to the 37th overall selection of that draft. And in 5 years, he has been a 3-time Pro Bowler for the Philadelphia Eagles, Landon Dickerson. Now, a completely different position. But the point is that we have seen medicals drop guys a little bit in the draft. I don't necessarily think that Tyson's going to go into the second rounds, but if you told me he fell to the middle to end of the first round, I would not be shocked just based upon what the medicals might bring. But the point of the conversation is he's going to be good in the NFL when he's available. But the thing about Dickerson, right, is that Dickerson's been good with the Eagles, but you know what we're hearing right now around the Philadelphia area right now, Joe? Apparently there's some conversations after 5 seasons that Landon Dickerson might be thinking about retiring because his body's beat up. That's the worry that we're trying to illustrate here is 1, draft slot, but 2, long-term projection. Even if Landon Dickerson retires this offseason, he was well worth an early second-round pick because he ended up, being a part of multiple Super Bowl teams, and he was a 3-time Pro Bowler in 5 years. So that's great. But the point is that comforts with the immediate versus the long-term future for a football player, especially a guy that you're drafting in the first rounds. Everyone, I think, loves Jordyn Tyson for the most part as an NFL draft prospect, but these are the conversations that are being had behind the scenes for these NFL teams in terms of short-term versus long-term, and how much can we trust that long-term window of success. And I think that Landon Dickerson's kind of an interesting parallel that we can make, although different situation, different position of that kind of that short-term versus long-term payback that we're talking about here.
Last guy, let's talk about Caleb Banks, who has been a riser since the Senior Bowl. He has been a building name in a class that I think needs rare athletes, needs a blue chip player to get excited about. He missed most of this year due to a foot injury. He does not have the same issues of a long injury history like Tyson. Where do you stand on Caleb Banks? Do you think that and also providing the context of the details of what would hurt him this year, do you think that Caleb Banks is going to get held back by the injury that he suffered this season?
Short term, no, which is why I think that I don't think that it will necessarily make him drop a ton. And of course, we're talking about the foot injury that cost him the majority of the 2025 college football season. Joe, I brought this one up to you, though, because I feel like nobody has really talked about the foot issue with Caleb Banks. And for me, when we're talking about a 6'6", 335-pound defensive tackle, foot injuries are scary, man. Like, that's a scary proposition for a player of that size, of that position. It's similar to the big men conversation in the NBA when they start having foot injuries. Like, those things don't typically just go away and never resurface. Like, it is a scary proposition because no matter what, you're on your feet, man. And you are putting a lot of wear and tear on your lower body. And those foot issues, I think, tend to kind of creep back a little bit for some players. So I don't think it's necessarily going to drop him much, if at all. But I do think that it's just interesting in terms of like that full scope, long-term outlook projection for NFL teams. How much do you worry about a 335-pound, 6'6" man with foot injury? Like that kind of, for me, is a little bit of a troubling just injury to have for that position, for that body type. I am a little bit curious why no one's really talked about that much, because that is an issue that I think can surface again potentially in the future with just his body type.
I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to try and take the angle of. No, I'm not. I'm not going to try and take the angle of, I think that X injury translates to long-term problems in whatever degree. I think you bring up a good point when you have foot problems. I just don't know what exactly the foot issue was. I do think very simply, Banks not having a long list of issues, I don't think that really bothers me personally very, very much.
Right.
But I do kind of come to this belief, as you're saying, another position group that's got some really solid options. Do teams choose to just hold off, maybe hope that he falls to them, or maybe to some degree hope that one of these other guys is on the radar and have somebody that would be more consistently available? Defensive tackle, right. I know that there's been a little bit more of a discourse after the Super Bowl with the defensive tackle impact from the Seahawks defensive line, but I think that defensive tackles, you don't need the superstar. You just need a solid starter. His position might ultimately be what kills him in this situation. If he was a pass rusher and he was an otherworldly pass rusher, taking the risk with an injury on a player who you think could be a 15-sack pass rusher is a very different conversation. It's also different with Jermon McCoy, who we talked about the other day. McCoy, being a corner, coming off the ACL, I'd take that risk because having a shutdown corner is incredibly important. Having a top defensive tackle in the league is not as key for your defense reaching its potential. You can get by with average level starters with elite athletes everywhere else. But I firmly do believe that Caleb Banks is worth overlooking that problem, because the kid is an unbelievable athlete for his size. And I think he could end up being one of the most disruptive defensive tackles in the league if he's given the opportunity to do so.
So a little bit more context, because I did a little bit more digging on it as I was talking, looking through notes and whatnot.
Okay.
So it was a foot issue that was initially just called a significant foot injury during fall camp. And then he re-aggravated against LSU, Joe, which required surgery. So it sounds like it was a broken foot is kind of what we're talking about here, right? I'm not overly worried, because until it's a recurring issue, I don't feel like you need to be overly worried about it. My point, though, and something that you just said, I think that's kind of going to spark an interesting one, is that what makes Caleb Banks so rare is not that he's 6'6", 335 pounds, and that has 35-inch arms or whatever. What makes him rare is that he's that, and he's so explosive for his size. If that does become a issue that rises again and becomes kind of a more consistent-ish issue, then that might zap what makes him such a special player. Because without that explosiveness, he's still 6'6", 335 and can play, right? So he can still play, but is he a difference maker if he doesn't have that same level of explosiveness? I don't necessarily think that he is, right? Like, is he just going to be a good two-gapping defensive tackle who's going to hold the point of attack consistently? I don't think so. I think he's a guy that you want to create some penetration opportunities for, and that explosiveness, I think, is a huge barometer of just how good he can be, right? So that's where I get semi-worried, but I do think we're on the same page in terms of, until it becomes a recurring issue, I'm comfortable still drafting him somewhere in the first round because he's such a freaky athlete. But I am full scope, full transparency. I'd be lying if I wasn't a little bit just like, foot issues sometimes come back, man. So like, if that becomes a recurring issue, that would bring worry. But I agree with you today. I'm not worried about it until it does become a recurring issue. But I do think the fact that he he re-aggravated it against LSU and then needed surgery for it, I think that is a negative sign of like he thought he was back from the foot issue and then all of a sudden you re-aggravate it and then you require surgery. So that is kind of where that's where my hesitancy comes from in terms of just being full stop. I'm in on Caleb Banks. I'm in on the athlete Caleb Banks, but I do think there's a lot of layers to the evaluation of Caleb Banks.
We'll see what happens with Tyson and with Banks. Hit that like button and subscribe, folks, and we'll be back with more.